The autumn of 1856 arrived early in Whitmore Valley, a remote settlement nestled between the rolling hills of upstate New York. The first frost had already claimed the maple leaves, turning them into brittle copper coins that scattered across the dirt roads with each passing wind. It was here, in this forgotten corner of the world, that the Sacred Heart Orphanage stood like a stone sentinel against the darkening sky. Margaret Whitfield pressed her face against the cold window of the horse-drawn wagon as it creaked up the winding path toward the imposing brick structure. At 14, she had already seen more of the world's cruelty than most adults, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of Sacred Heart. The building seemed to absorb the weak October sunlight, its 3 stories of red brick darkened by decades of weather and shadow. Gothic windows stared down like hollow eyes, and the bell tower that crowned the structure disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. "There she is, child," muttered Thomas Hartwell, the county official who had been tasked with delivering Margaret to her new home. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as the horses snorted nervously, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Sacred Heart Orphanage, been serving the community for nigh on 20 years now. Margaret pulled her thin woolen shawl closer around her shoulders. The death of her parents in the mill fire 3 weeks ago still felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Now, with no relatives willing to take her in, she was being delivered to this place like a package marked unwanted. "Tell me again about the people who run it, Mr. Hartwell," she said quietly, though she had already heard the story twice during their day-long journey from Albany. Hartwell cleared his throat, a habit he had when discussing matters that made him uncomfortable. "The Sacred Heart congregation, good Christian folks though, particular in their ways, founded by Reverend Josiah Blackwood back in '36. They follow the old doctrines, believe in discipline and hard work as the path to salvation." He paused, glancing at the girl beside him. "They'll provide for you, Margaret, food, shelter, education, more than many orphans can hope for these days." As they drew closer, Margaret could make out more details of the building. Iron bars covered the lower windows, and she noticed that several of the upper windows had been boarded shut with rough planks. A high stone wall surrounded the property, broken only by the heavy wooden gate through which they now passed. The gate bore the inscription, "Sacred Heart Orphanage, founded 1836, suffer the little children to come unto me." The wagon wheels crunched over gravel as they approached the main entrance. Margaret counted at least 30 windows across the front of the building, but only a few showed any signs of life. A pale face that quickly disappeared behind a curtain, the flicker of candlelight in what might have been a classroom. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the surrounding pine forest. A figure emerged from the front door as they came to a stop. Sister Prudence Blackwood, no relation to the Reverend, despite sharing his name, was a woman of indeterminate age whose severe black dress and white bonnet made her appear as a living shadow against the brick facade. Her face was sharp and angular, with deep-set gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Margaret's appearance in a single glance. "Miss Whitfield, I presume," Sister Prudence said, her voice carrying the flat tones of someone unaccustomed to warmth. "We have been expecting you." Margaret climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long journey. She carried only a small carpet bag containing her few remaining possessions: a change of clothes, her mother's prayer book, and a small wooden doll her father had carved for her 8th birthday. "I'll be taking my leave then," Hartwell said, clearly eager to depart before the approaching darkness. He handed Sister Prudence a manila envelope. "Her papers are all in order. County's paid the first year's boarding fee." Sister Prudence accepted the envelope without looking at it. "The Lord provides, Mr. Hartwell. We shall care for the child according to his will." As the wagon disappeared down the drive, its rattling gradually swallowed by the evening mist, Margaret felt truly alone for the first time in her life. The massive door of Sacred Heart Orphanage closed behind her with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. The interior of the building was scarcely warmer than the October air outside. A long hallway stretched before them, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the wooden wainscoting. The walls were painted a dull green that might once have been cheerful, but now seemed sickly in the flickering light. Margaret's footsteps echoed hollowly on the polished floor as Sister Prudence led her deeper into the building. "You will follow the schedule without deviation," Sister Prudence said as they walked. "Rising bell at 5 o'clock, morning prayers at 5:30, breakfast at 6, followed by lessons until noon, afternoon work assignments until evening prayers at 6, supper at 7, lights out at 8. Sunday services are mandatory, as is evening Bible study. They passed several closed doors, each bearing a small brass nameplate: Classroom A, Sewing Room, Pantry. Margaret noticed that some of the doors bore additional hardware, heavy iron bolts that could only be operated from the hallway side. "How many girls live here?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Numbers change according to the Lord's plan," Sister Prudence replied curtly. "Currently, we house 43 girls between the ages of 6 and 16. You will find them to be well-disciplined and devoted to their studies." They climbed a narrow staircase to the second floor, where the hallway branched in two directions. Sister Prudence turned left, leading Margaret past more closed doors. The silence was oppressive, no sound of conversation, laughter, or even footsteps from behind the doors. "This wing houses the older girls," Sister Prudence explained. "The younger children reside in the East Wing. Fraternization between age groups is strictly forbidden outside of supervised activities." They stopped before a door marked Dormitory 3. Sister Prudence produced a large iron key from somewhere within her black dress and unlocked the door. The room beyond was Spartan in the extreme. 8 narrow iron beds arranged in 2 rows, each with a small wooden chest at its foot. A single window, barred like those Margaret had seen from outside, provided the only natural light. "You will occupy bed 7, Sister Prudence said, indicating a cot near the window. "Your dormitory mates are currently at evening prayers. You will join them tomorrow for the full schedule." Margaret placed her carpetbag on the thin mattress and looked around the room. Each bed was made with military precision, the gray wool blankets pulled so tight they could probably bounce a coin. Personal items were apparently not permitted. The wooden chests appeared to contain only the standard issue clothing and toiletries. "Sister Prudence," Margaret said hesitantly, "might I ask about the other girls? Are they happy here?" The older woman's gray eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her take a step backward. "Happiness, child, is a fleeting earthly concern. We are here to prepare souls for eternal salvation, not to indulge in temporal pleasures. The girls of Sacred Heart learn discipline, obedience, and devotion. They find peace in submission to God's will." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, measured, synchronized steps that spoke of rigid training. The dormitory door opened and 7 girls filed in silently. They ranged in age from perhaps 12 to 16, all wearing identical gray dresses with white aprons. Their hair was pulled back severely and covered with white caps. "Girls, this is Margaret Whitfield," Sister Prudence announced. "She will be joining Dormitory 3. I trust you will help her understand our ways." The girls looked at Margaret with expressions that were carefully neutral, but she caught something in their eyes. A flicker of warning, perhaps, or sadness quickly suppressed. None of them spoke. "Lights out in 30 minutes, Sister Prudence continued. "Margaret, you will find a nightgown and daily attire in your chest. Morning prayers begin promptly at 5:30. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One final word of advice, child. The Sacred Heart has many rooms, but not all of them are meant for exploration. Curious girls often find themselves reassigned to other duties. I trust I make myself clear." The door closed with a decisive click, followed by the sound of the key turning in the lock. Margaret stared at the door in shock. They were locked in for the night. "Don't look so surprised," said a voice from across the room. Margaret turned to see a girl of about her own age with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. "I'm Ruth Morrison. Been here 2 years now. You'll get used to the locks. They say it's for our own protection." "Protection from what?" Margaret asked. Ruth glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. "From wandering where we shouldn't. This place, it's bigger than it looks from outside. Lots of corridors that don't appear on any map. Stairs that go to floors that aren't supposed to exist." An older girl named Sarah, perhaps 16, looked up from where she was folding her day clothes. "Ruth, don't fill her head with nonsense. The rules exist for good reasons." But Ruth continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Tell her about the transfer list, Sarah. Tell her about the girls who get called away in the middle of the night and never come back." Sarah's face paled, but she said nothing more. The other girls had gone about their evening routines in silence, but Margaret could sense their tension. She changed into the rough cotton nightgown from her chest and climbed into the narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. As the oil lamp was extinguished and darkness settled over dormitory 3, Margaret stared up at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the old building settling around her. Somewhere in the distance she could hear what might have been footsteps on a wooden floor, but the sound was so faint it could have been her imagination. Ruth's voice came softly through the darkness. "Margaret? Welcome to Sacred Heart. Whatever brought you here, whatever you've lost, it's nothing compared to what you might lose if you're not careful." "What do you mean?" Margaret whispered back. "Just remember, when they call your name for transfer, it's not to a loving family. No one ever writes letters back, no one ever visits. The girls who leave Sacred Heart, they just disappear." Margaret wanted to ask more questions, but the exhaustion of the day finally overtook her fear. As she drifted toward sleep, she thought she heard something else. A sound like crying, very faint and far away, coming from somewhere deep within the walls of Sacred Heart Orphanage. Outside her barred window, the autumn wind whistled through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the faint, persistent smell of something that might have been old smoke. Margaret's first full day at Sacred Heart Orphanage began before dawn, with the harsh clanging of a brass bell that echoed through every corridor of the building. She jolted awake in the unfamiliar bed, her heart racing as the other girls in dormitory 3 rose silently and began their morning routines with practiced efficiency. 5 o'clock every morning, 7 days a week, Ruth Morrison whispered as she pulled on her gray dress. "Don't ever be late to anything here, Margaret. Sister Prudence keeps a leather strap for girls who can't follow a schedule." The warning proved unnecessary. Margaret had been too anxious to sleep deeply, and the previous evening's conversation had left her nerves on edge. She dressed quickly in the rough woolen garments from her chest, a gray dress identical to those worn by the other girls, a white apron that tied at the waist, and thick black stockings that scratched against her skin. At precisely 5:30, the dormitory door was unlocked by Sister Agatha, a younger woman whose round face might have been kind under different circumstances. "Form ranks, girls. Silent procession to the chapel." The 43 residents of Sacred Heart Orphanage gathered in the main hallway, arranged by age and dormitory in perfect lines. Margaret found herself positioned between Ruth and a thin girl named Elizabeth, who couldn't have been more than 13. As they moved through the building's corridors, Margaret noticed details that had escaped her attention the previous evening. The walls were lined with religious texts in ornate frames, but many of the passages seemed strangely specific. "Spare the rod and spoil the child. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," and most prominently displayed above each doorway, "Through suffering comes purification." The building's architecture revealed itself to be more complex than Margaret had realized. Hallways branched off in directions that seemed geometrically impossible, and she counted at least 4 different staircases leading to the upper floors. The chapel occupied the entire west wing of the ground floor, its vaulted ceiling supported by heavy wooden beams that disappeared into shadow above. Stained glass windows depicted scenes of biblical suffering: Job afflicted with boils, Daniel in the lion's den, and prominently featured behind the altar, a graphic representation of Christ's crucifixion that emphasized every wound and drop of blood. Reverend Josiah Blackwood stood at the pulpit like a figure carved from black marble. He was a tall, gaunt man in his 60s, with iron gray hair and eyes the color of winter storms. His black robe seemed to absorb the morning light filtering through the windows, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Let us pray," he began, and every head in the chapel bowed in unison. "Almighty God, we thank thee for another day to serve thy will. We are but vessels for thy divine purpose, and we submit ourselves completely to thy guidance. Help us to remember that suffering is the path to salvation, and that those who endure hardship with patience shall be rewarded in thy eternal kingdom." The prayer continued for nearly 20 minutes, a litany of submission and self-denial that made Margaret's knees ache on the hard wooden floor. When it finally ended, the girls filed out in the same silent procession that had brought them to the chapel. Breakfast was served in a long, narrow room lined with wooden tables and benches. The meal consisted of thin porridge, a slice of dark bread, and water, hardly enough to sustain a growing child, but more than many orphans could expect. Margaret noticed that the younger girls, seated at tables near the front of the room, looked particularly pale and thin. "You're wondering about the little ones," Ruth said quietly, spooning her porridge with mechanical movements. "They get less food as part of their training. Sister Prudence says hunger teaches humility." Margaret watched as a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old struggled to lift her spoon, her small hands trembling with weakness. "That's cruel," she whispered. "Cruel is thinking you have a choice in the matter," said Elizabeth from across the table. Her voice carried a bitterness that seemed wrong coming from someone so young. "The sooner you understand that, the longer you'll survive here." After breakfast, the girls were divided into groups for their morning lessons. Margaret found herself assigned to Classroom B, where Sister Martha, a middle-aged woman with permanently ink-stained fingers, taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. The lessons themselves were standard enough, but the reading material consisted entirely of religious texts, and even the arithmetic problems carried moral weight. If a sinful child tells 3 lies in one day, and lying is a transgression that requires 1 hour of penance, how much prayer time must the child complete to achieve forgiveness? During the arithmetic lesson, Margaret became aware of a strange rhythmic sound coming from somewhere above them, a steady thump-thump-thump that seemed to be moving along the ceiling. Sister Martha appeared not to notice, or perhaps had grown so accustomed to the sound that it no longer registered. "Sister Martha," a girl named Anne raised her hand tentatively. "What's that noise upstairs?" The teacher's face went rigid. "That is nothing that concerns you, Anne. Return to your calculations immediately." The sound continued for another few minutes, then gradually faded away. Margaret noticed that several of the girls looked genuinely frightened, and Ruth kept glancing toward the ceiling with an expression of deep unease. At noon, the academic lessons ended, and the girls were assigned to their afternoon work duties. Margaret was sent to the laundry room in the basement, a damp, poorly lit space where massive iron tubs and washboards occupied most of the floor. The work was backbreaking, hauling buckets of water from the well outside, scrubbing endless piles of gray dresses and white aprons, and hanging the wet garments on lines strung across the room. It was here, surrounded by the steam and noise of the laundry operation, that Margaret first heard the stories that would haunt her nights. "My sister Louise was here before me," said a girl named Catherine as she scrubbed a stubborn stain from an apron. "She was 15 when I arrived 2 years ago. Sweet girl, never caused any trouble, always followed the rules perfectly." "What happened to her?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Transfer list," Catherine replied bitterly. "One night in October, Sister Prudence came to our dormitory after lights out, called Louise's name, told her to pack her things, said a family in Rochester had requested an older girl to help with their household." Catherine's hands stilled on the washboard. "But Louise never wanted to leave. She was terrified of being separated from me. I'm all the family she had left." Ruth, working at the next tub, looked up from her washing. "How many girls have you known who've been transferred, Catherine?" 17, in the 2 years I've been here." Catherine's voice was barely audible above the sound of sloshing water. "And not one of them has ever sent so much as a letter back." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret heard more stories. Girls who had been called away in the middle of the night, transfers that always seemed to happen during the dark months of winter, families who allegedly requested specific types of children, always the older girls, always those who had shown signs of independence or questioning. "There's something else," Ruth said as they hung wet clothes on the lines. "Have you noticed that we never see the transfer list before names are called? Sister Prudence always says the request came by post, but the mail only comes twice a week. And somehow these urgent adoptions always happen on nights when no mail has arrived." Margaret was beginning to understand the source of the fear she had sensed in the other girls. Sacred Heart Orphanage operated according to rules that went far beyond the strict daily schedule. There were unspoken laws that governed survival itself. That evening, during the supervised recreation period in the main hall, Margaret observed the complex social dynamics that had developed among the residents. The younger girls huddled together in small groups, speaking in whispers and casting nervous glances toward the nuns who supervised them. The older girls maintained careful facades of compliance while managing to communicate through subtle gestures and meaningful looks. "See that girl by the window?" Ruth nodded toward a pale teenager with dark circles under her eyes. "That's Mary Kellerman. She's been here 4 years, longer than almost anyone. Rumor is she survived because she never asks questions and never shows any personality at all. Margaret studied Mary, noting the girl's unnaturally rigid posture and the way her eyes seemed to focus on nothing at all. She looks like she's not really here. Maybe that's the point, Ruth replied. Maybe disappearing inside yourself is the only way to avoid the transfer list. As they spoke, Sister Prudence entered the recreation hall, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of particular severity. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as conversations died away, and every girl turned toward the imposing figure in black. "Evening announcements," Sister Prudence declared, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Tomorrow, we will have visitors from the County Board of Supervisors. Every girl will conduct herself with absolute propriety. Any deviation from normal behavior will result in immediate disciplinary action." She paused, allowing her gray eyes to sweep across the assembled faces. "Additionally, I have received several inquiries from prospective families seeking to provide homes for deserving children. The following girls will prepare themselves for possible interviews: Sarah Mitchell, Anna Kowalski, and..." Her voice trailed off as she consulted her clipboard. "Margaret Whitfield." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, the other girls went completely still. Ruth's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight enough to hurt. "Interviews will be conducted tomorrow evening after supper," Sister Prudence continued. "The girls in question will report to my office at 7 o'clock sharp. They should prepare themselves to demonstrate their accomplishments in needlework, reading, and domestic skills." As Sister Prudence left the hall, the silence persisted for several long moments. When conversation finally resumed, it was hushed and urgent. "3 names," whispered Elizabeth. "There are never 3 names at once." Ruth leaned close to Margaret's ear. "Something's different about this. The county visit, the interviews. They're planning something bigger than usual." That night, as Margaret lay in her narrow bed listening to the sound of wind through the pine trees outside, she tried to make sense of what she had learned during her first full day at Sacred Heart. The orphanage operated according to a system that seemed designed not to care for children, but to break their spirits systematically. The transfer list wasn't about finding homes for orphans. It was something else entirely, something that explained the fear in every girl's eyes and the careful way they moved through their daily routines. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the corridors like a gunshot. Margaret counted at least 20 heartbeats before the silence returned. "Ruth," she whispered into the darkness, "I'm awake. The interview's tomorrow. What do you think they really want?" Ruth was quiet for so long that Margaret thought she had fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of knowledge that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "I think they're getting ready to make room for new arrivals. Winter's coming, and the county always sends more children when the weather turns cold. They need space in the dormitories." Margaret felt her stomach clench with fear. "How do they make space?" "The same way they always do," Ruth replied. 3 girls go missing. 3 beds open up. By Christmas, Sarah, Anna, and you will just be names that the younger girls whisper about when they think the sisters aren't listening. Outside, an owl called from somewhere deep in the forest, its voice carrying across the darkness like a lament for the lost. Margaret pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried not to think about the transfer list, but sleep remained elusive. When she finally dozed, her dreams were filled with the sound of footsteps in empty corridors and the sight of 73 names written in an ancient Bible, each one followed by the same phrase: "Purified, not forgotten." The county supervisors arrived at Sacred Heart Orphanage on a gray November morning that threatened snow. Margaret watched from the window of Classroom B as 3 men in dark suits climbed down from a horse-drawn carriage, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. They carried leather satchels and wore the expressions of officials conducting routine business, but their presence had transformed the atmosphere inside the building into something electric with tension. "Eyes on your slates, girls," Sister Martha commanded sharply. "The affairs of administration are not your concern." But Margaret could feel the nervous energy radiating from every girl in the room. Even Sister Martha seemed on edge, her usual stern demeanor replaced by something approaching anxiety. The morning lessons proceeded with mechanical precision, but the underlying current of fear was unmistakable. During the lunch break, Margaret noticed that several areas of the building had been hastily blocked off with heavy curtains. The staircase leading to the 3rd floor was now guarded by Sister Agatha, who turned away any girl who approached with a curt, "Upper floors are being cleaned today. Keep to your assigned areas." "They do this every time officials visit," Ruth explained, as they sat in the dining hall picking at their meager portions of bread and thin soup. "Certain parts of the building become mysteriously off-limits. Rooms that are always locked suddenly need maintenance." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "My first year here, I tried to peek behind one of those curtains during an inspection. Sister Prudence caught me and I spent 3 days in the reflection room." "What's the reflection room?" Margaret asked. Ruth and Elizabeth exchanged a look. "Basement storage area," Ruth said quietly. "No windows, no light except for a single candle. They lock you in there with nothing but a Bible and tell you to contemplate your sins. Some girls come out different after a few days in there." As the afternoon progressed, Margaret noticed that the older girls seemed increasingly agitated. During their work assignments, conversations died whenever a sister approached, and she caught several girls making subtle hand signals that seemed to carry coded meanings. The breakthrough came during the evening recreation period, when a girl named Helen approached Margaret with studied casualness. Helen was perhaps 15, with prematurely gray streaks in her brown hair and the gaunt appearance of someone who had been at Sacred Heart longer than most. "I heard you're one of the 3 called for interviews tonight," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, her stomach tightening with apprehension. "There's something you need to see before you go to Sister Prudence's office," Helen continued. "Something that might help you understand what you're really dealing with." She glanced around the recreation hall, then leaned closer. "After evening prayers, when they think we're all settled for the night, meet me in the laundry room. But Margaret, if you get caught, you can never say I was involved. Promise me." Margaret promised, though the request filled her with dread. As the evening routine progressed through prayers, supper, and the final roll call, she tried to appear normal while her mind raced with possibilities. What could Helen want to show her that was worth the risk of severe punishment? At 8 o'clock, the dormitory doors were locked as usual, but Margaret had prepared for this. During her work assignment in the laundry room, she had noticed that one of the basement windows had a broken latch. It would be a dangerous climb down to the first floor, but not impossible for someone desperate enough to try. She waited until the sounds of the building had settled into the deep quiet of night, then carefully slipped out of bed. Ruth stirred, but didn't wake as Margaret made her way to the window. The broken latch yielded to pressure, and the window swung open on hinges that creaked softly in protest. The climb down was treacherous. The brick exterior of Sacred Heart offered few handholds, and the November wind cut through her thin nightgown like ice. But Margaret's desperation gave her strength, and she managed to lower herself to the ground without attracting attention. The basement entrance was unlocked as Helen had promised it would be. Margaret slipped inside, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. A single candle flickered near the laundry tubs, and Helen's silhouette moved in the shadows beyond. "You came," Helen said, relief evident in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "What did you want to show me?" Margaret asked, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. Helen picked up the candle and motioned for Margaret to follow. "It's not what I want to show you, it's what you need to see if you want to survive your interview tonight." They moved deeper into the basement, past the laundry room, and into areas Margaret had never seen before. The corridors here were older, carved from natural stone rather than built with brick. The air smelled of dampness and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Sacred Heart is much older than they tell us," Helen whispered as they walked. "The orphanage was built on top of something else, something the congregation has been using for their own purposes since the beginning." They stopped before a wooden door bound with iron straps. Helen produced a key from somewhere in her nightgown. Where she had obtained it, Margaret didn't ask. "This leads to the original foundation," Helen explained. "The basement beneath the basement, the place where the transferred girls really go." The key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been used recently. Beyond the door, stone steps led down into absolute darkness. The smell that Margaret had noticed earlier became stronger. Decay, mixed with something chemical and sharp. "Helen, what is this place?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "See for yourself," Helen replied, starting down the steps. "But prepare yourself, Margaret. What you're about to see will change everything you thought you knew about Sacred Heart." They descended perhaps 20 steps before the staircase opened into a larger space. Helen raised the candle, and its light revealed a scene that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. The chamber was larger than the entire footprint of the building above, extending far beyond the reach of their single candle's illumination. Stone pillars supported a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow overhead, but it was the contents of the room that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Along the walls, arranged in neat rows like books on shelves, were dozens of wooden caskets. Each one was marked with a small brass nameplate, and many of them showed signs of recent construction. The wood was clean and new, not aged like the ancient stone around them. "Dear God," Margaret whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Helen moved closer to one of the caskets, holding the candle high to illuminate the nameplate. "Louise Catherine Morrison," she read aloud. "Transferred October 15th, 1856. Purified, not forgotten." Margaret stared at the nameplate in horror. "Louise?" "Ruth's sister Louise. And here's another one you might recognize," Helen said, moving to a casket 3 spaces down. "Mary Elizabeth Hartwell, transferred December 3rd, 1855. The names continued, row after row of brass plates marking the final resting places of girls who had supposedly been adopted by loving families. Margaret counted at least 50 caskets, with space for many more along the unfinished sections of wall. "How long have you known about this?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. 6 months, Helen replied. "I found the key in Sister Prudence's desk when I was cleaning her office. I've been coming down here whenever I could, trying to understand what they're doing." Margaret moved deeper into the chamber, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. Near the back wall, she discovered something that made her blood run cold, a wooden table stained dark with what could only be old blood. Medical instruments lay scattered across its surface. Scalpels, bone saws, and bottles filled with clear liquid that smelled strongly of chemicals. "Helen," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "they're not just killing the girls, they're doing something to them first." Helen nodded grimly. "The congregation believes in purification through suffering, but their idea of purification goes far beyond anything described in the Bible. They think pain can cleanse the soul completely, prepare it for immediate entry into heaven." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. "The interviews tonight, they're not looking for girls to adopt. They're selecting the next group for purification," Helen confirmed. "Girls who've shown signs of independence, curiosity, or resistance to their teachings. They can't risk having anyone who might expose what's really happening here." As they stood in the chamber of the dead, surrounded by the evidence of Sacred Heart's true purpose, Margaret began to understand the full scope of the horror that had been hidden beneath the orphanage's facade of Christian charity. The strict rules, the isolation, the systematic breaking of the girls' spirits, it was all designed to create the perfect victims for whatever twisted ritual the congregation practiced in this underground chamber. "We have to get out of here," Margaret said suddenly. "We have to tell someone. The county supervisors, the sheriff, anyone who will listen." Helen shook her head sadly. "The county supervisors are part of it, Margaret. Why do you think they visit so regularly? They're not here to inspect the facility. They're here to select which girls should be transferred next." The full implications of their situation began to sink in. They were completely isolated, surrounded by adults who viewed them not as children to be protected, but as raw material for some incomprehensible religious ritual. The outside world believed that Sacred Heart Orphanage was a haven for unwanted children, not a slaughterhouse disguised as a sanctuary. "Then what can we do?" Margaret asked desperately. "Survive," Helen replied simply. "Avoid the transfer list as long as possible, and hope that someone eventually discovers the truth." They made their way back through the basement corridors, careful to lock the door behind them and return the key to its hiding place. The climb back to the second-floor window was even more dangerous than the descent, but Margaret's fear gave her strength. She slipped back into dormitory 3 just as the distant clock tower chimed 11 o'clock. Ruth was awake, waiting by the window. "Where were you?" she whispered urgently. Margaret climbed back into her bed, her whole body trembling from cold and terror. "I can't tell you here," she whispered back. "But Ruth, your sister Louise." Ruth's face went pale in the moonlight streaming through the barred window. "What about Louise?" "She never left Sacred Heart," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "None of them did." Before Ruth could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside their dormitory. Margaret quickly pulled her blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, forcing her breathing to become slow and regular. The footsteps paused outside their door, and she could hear the soft sound of a key being inserted into the lock. The door opened with its familiar creak. Through her barely opened eyelids, Margaret could see Sister Prudence standing in the doorway, holding a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the walls. The sister's gray eyes moved methodically from bed to bed, studying each sleeping form with the intensity of a predator checking her traps. Sarah Mitchell, Anna Kowalski, Margaret Whitfield, Sister Prudence said softly, her voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. Time for your interviews. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she sat up, trying to appear groggy and confused. Around her, Sarah and Anna were also stirring, their faces pale with fear in the lantern light. The other girls in the dormitory remained perfectly still, but Margaret could sense their terror radiating through the darkness. "Dress quickly," Sister Prudence commanded. "You have 5 minutes." The 3 girls pulled on their gray dresses with mechanical movements, their hands shaking as they tied aprons and smoothed their hair. Margaret caught Sarah's eye for a moment and saw her own terror reflected there. Anna, the youngest of the 3 at barely 13, looked as though she might faint. Sister Prudence led them through corridors that Margaret had never seen before, up a narrow staircase to a part of the building that seemed oddly separated from the rest. The walls here were paneled in dark wood, and oil paintings of stern religious figures glared down at them from ornate frames. The air smelled of beeswax and something else, something medicinal that made Margaret think of the underground chamber. They stopped before a heavy oak door marked private office. Sister Prudence knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. The room beyond was unlike anything Margaret had seen at Sacred Heart. Rich carpets covered the floor, and the walls were lined with leather-bound books. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting warm light across furniture that would have been expensive even in the finest homes of Albany. It was as if they had stepped through a doorway into an entirely different world. Reverend Josiah Blackwood stood behind a massive desk, still wearing his black robes but now adorned with additional symbols that Margaret didn't recognize, silver chains bearing strange medallions, and a ring that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the firelight. His winter storm eyes studied the 3 girls with an intensity that made Margaret feel exposed and vulnerable. "Ah, our candidates," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less. "Please come in. Don't be afraid." The 3 county supervisors Margaret had seen earlier were seated in leather chairs near the fireplace. Up close, they looked less like government officials and more like predators who had found their prey. Their dark suits seemed to absorb the light, and their faces bore expressions of anticipation that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Gentlemen," Reverend Blackwood said, gesturing toward the girls, "may I present our 3 candidates for consideration. Sarah Mitchell, 16 years old, with us for 2 years. Anna Kowalski, 13, arrived 8 months ago. And our newest addition, Margaret Whitfield, age 14. One of the supervisors, a thin man with silver hair and dead black eyes, leaned forward in his chair. "Tell us about their temperaments, Reverend. We require subjects with specific qualities." "Of course, Mr. Grimsby," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Sarah has shown remarkable resilience. She continues to maintain hope despite repeated disappointments. Anna possesses an almost supernatural capacity for fear, which makes her particularly suitable for our purposes. And Margaret," his eyes fixed on her with disturbing intensity, "Margaret has already demonstrated curiosity about areas of the facility that are meant to remain private." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. They knew about her nocturnal expedition. Somehow they had been watching. "Excellent," said another supervisor, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers. "When can the purification process begin?" "Tomorrow evening would be ideal," Blackwood replied. "The new moon provides optimal conditions, and we've prepared the chamber according to the old traditions." Margaret realized with horror that they were discussing the 3 girls as if they weren't even present, or as if their presence was irrelevant to decisions that had already been made. They were cattle being evaluated for slaughter, nothing more. "I have a question," Sarah said suddenly, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "What happened to the girls who were transferred before us? Where did they really go?" The room fell silent. The supervisors exchanged meaningful glances, and Reverend Blackwood's expression shifted from false warmth to something far more sinister. "An excellent question, my dear," he said slowly. "Would you like to see for yourself?" Without waiting for an answer, he moved to a section of the bookshelf and pulled down a leather-bound volume. The shelf swung inward, revealing a hidden staircase that led down into darkness. The medicinal smell that Margaret had noticed earlier became stronger, mixed now with something that reminded her of the slaughterhouses she had seen in Albany. The Sacred Heart congregation has practiced the ancient art of purification for over 20 years, Blackwood explained as he lit a lantern from the fireplace. "We have perfected techniques that ensure complete cleansing of the soul before its journey to the next world. The girls who have undergone this process are indeed transferred to a far better place than any earthly family could provide." Margaret's mind raced as they were herded toward the hidden staircase. This wasn't the same underground chamber that Helen had shown her. This was something else, something that connected directly to Blackwood's private office. How many hidden spaces existed beneath Sacred Heart? How long had this nightmare been going on? As they descended the narrow stone steps, Margaret could hear Anna whimpering quietly behind her. The walls here were older than those in the basement chamber, carved from living rock and stained with substances she didn't want to identify. Symbols had been carved into the stone, crosses mixed with other shapes that seemed to writhe and shift in the lantern light. The staircase opened into a circular chamber that took Margaret's breath away. The room was perhaps 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow overhead. The floor was inlaid with an intricate pattern of colored stones that formed a design Margaret recognized from her mother's books about ancient religions, a pentagram surrounded by symbols that predated Christianity by thousands of years. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with the evidence of countless rituals. Channels had been carved into the stone to direct blood toward a collection basin, and the entire structure was surrounded by candles that had been lit in preparation for their arrival. "Behold," Reverend Blackwood said, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "the heart of Sacred Heart, the place where suffering becomes salvation, where pain becomes purity." The 3 county supervisors had followed them into the chamber, and Margaret now understood that they weren't government officials at all. They wore the same strange medallions as Blackwood, and their faces bore expressions of religious ecstasy that was far more terrifying than simple cruelty. "The ancient wisdom teaches us that the soul can only be purified through the complete destruction of the flesh," Blackwood continued, setting his lantern on a stone ledge.
"We do God's work here, my children. We save souls that would otherwise be lost to sin and suffering." Margaret looked around the chamber and realized that escape was impossible. The staircase they had descended was the only visible exit, and it was blocked by Sister Prudence, who had followed them down. The walls were solid stone, and the ceiling was far too high to reach. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something that gave her a spark of hope.
Near the base of the far wall, partially hidden behind one of the stone pillars, was what looked like the opening to another passage. It was small, probably too narrow for an adult to navigate, but it might offer a way out for someone desperate enough to try. "Now then," Blackwood said, beginning to remove his outer robes to reveal garments underneath that were decorated with the same disturbing symbols. "Let us begin with the youngest. Anna, step forward." Anna collapsed to her knees, sobbing hysterically. "Please, I don't want to die. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." Margaret knew that this was their only chance. In moments, they would be bound to the altar, and whatever happened next would ensure that they joined the dozens of girls already entombed in the chamber beneath the orphanage. She caught Sarah's eye and nodded toward the small opening near the wall. "Sarah," she whispered urgently, "when I create a distraction, run for that passage." Before Sarah could respond, Margaret grabbed the nearest candle and hurled it at Reverend Blackwood. The flame caught his ceremonial robes, and he stumbled backward with a howl of rage and pain. In the confusion that followed, she shoved Anna toward the passage opening and screamed, "Run!" The chamber erupted into chaos. The county supervisors lunged toward the girls, but the narrow space made their movements clumsy. Sister Prudence blocked the main staircase, but Sarah had already reached the hidden passage and was pulling the still sobbing Anna behind her. Margaret dodged, grasping hands and diving bodies as she followed her friends toward the opening. Behind her, she could hear Blackwood shouting orders and the sound of men stumbling over each other in the darkness. A hand caught her nightgown, tearing the fabric, but she twisted free and dove through the passage opening just as fingers closed on empty air where she had been. The passage was even narrower than it had appeared, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through absolute darkness. The stone walls seemed to press in from all sides, and the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Behind them, they could hear angry voices and the sound of pursuit, but the passage was too small for the adults to follow. They crawled for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sharp stones cutting their knees and hands. Anna's sobs gradually subsided into exhausted whimpering, and Sarah's breathing came in ragged gasps that echoed off the stone walls. Finally, the passage began to widen, and they could see a faint light ahead. They emerged into another chamber, this one smaller and apparently natural rather than carved. Water dripped from stalactites overhead, and the air smelled of earth and growing things rather than death and chemicals. "Where are we?" Anna asked, her voice barely audible. Margaret looked around the chamber and realized that they had emerged somewhere beyond the foundation of the orphanage. The walls here were natural rock, and she could feel a current of fresh air coming from somewhere ahead. "I think we're in a cave system," she said. "These hills are full of them." They followed the source of fresh air through a series of smaller chambers, guided by starlight that grew gradually stronger as they climbed. Finally, they emerged through a crack in the hillside into the cold November night. The lights of Sacred Heart Orphanage glowed in the valley below them, looking deceptively peaceful against the dark forest. "We have to warn someone," Sarah said, shivering in her thin nightgown. "We have to tell people what's really happening there." Margaret nodded, but she knew their situation was desperate. They were 3 teenage girls in nightclothes, miles from the nearest town, with no proof of the horrors they had witnessed, except their own testimony. Who would believe such an incredible story? "First, we need to survive the night," she said practically. "Then we figure out how to expose Sacred Heart." As they made their way down the hillside toward the distant lights of Whitmore Valley, Margaret looked back once at the orphanage that had nearly claimed their lives. Somewhere in that building, dozens of other girls continued to live in fear, not knowing that their supposed sanctuary was actually an elaborate trap designed by religious fanatics who had perverted faith into something monstrous. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of approaching snow and the faint sound of bells ringing from the orphanage tower. Margaret shivered and pulled her torn nightgown tighter around her shoulders, wondering how many more girls would disappear before the truth about Sacred Heart finally came to light. Behind them, the sound of pursuit had faded, but Margaret knew their escape was only the beginning. The congregation would not give up easily, and 3 missing girls would force them to accelerate their plans for covering up their crimes. The race to expose Sacred Heart Orphanage had begun. The first light of dawn found Margaret, Sarah, and Anna huddled in the ruins of an abandoned mill on the outskirts of Whitmore Valley. They had walked through the night, their bare feet bleeding and their nightgowns torn by brambles, driven by the knowledge that Sacred Heart's reach extended far beyond its stone walls. The mill offered shelter from the bitter November wind, but little comfort for 3 girls who had nowhere left to run. "They'll be looking for us by now," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from the cold. She had torn strips from her nightgown to bandage Anna's cut feet, but the youngest girl was still shivering uncontrollably. "Sister Prudence will have noticed we're missing during morning roll call." Margaret peered through a crack in the mill's rotting timbers toward the road that led back to the orphanage. The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills, painting the autumn landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "We need to get to the sheriff's office in town," she said. "It's our only chance." "What if the sheriff is part of it too?" Anna asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if no one believes us?" It was a question that had haunted Margaret throughout their flight. The Sacred Heart congregation had operated their horrific practices for over 20 years without detection. That level of secrecy suggested influence that extended well beyond the orphanage grounds. How many officials in Whitmore Valley were complicit in the disappearances? How many turned blind eyes in exchange for donations to the church fund? "We have to try," Margaret said firmly. "If the sheriff won't listen, we'll find someone who will. There has to be someone in authority who isn't corrupted by whatever hold the congregation has on this valley." They made their way cautiously toward the town, keeping to the tree line and avoiding the main roads. Whitmore Valley was larger than Margaret had realized during her arrival 2 weeks ago. a prosperous community of perhaps 2,000 souls, supported by lumber mills, farms, and the iron foundry that provided employment for most of the men in the region. The houses were well maintained, the streets were clean, and everything spoke of a community that took pride in its moral standing. It was exactly the kind of place where a religious organization could operate with impunity, protected by the assumption that godly people were incapable of evil. The sheriff's office occupied a small brick building on Main Street, distinguished by iron bars on the windows and a sign that read, Sheriff Michael O'Brien, serving Whitmore Valley since 1851. Margaret studied the building from across the street, looking for any sign that it might be a trap. Everything appeared normal, horses tied to the hitching posts, townspeople going about their morning business, no sign of the black-robed figures she had come to fear. Wait here, she told Sarah and Anna, who had hidden themselves behind a delivery wagon. If this goes wrong, run toward the church at the end of the street. That's Protestant, not part of the Sacred Heart congregation. Margaret crossed the street and pushed open the door to the sheriff's office, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The interior was warm and smelled of coffee and tobacco smoke. A middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from his desk, taking in her torn nightgown and bandaged feet with obvious concern. Good Lord, child, what's happened to you? Sheriff O'Brien stood up quickly, reaching for a coat from a nearby chair. Are you hurt? Where are your parents? Please, Sheriff O'Brien, Margaret said, accepting the coat gratefully. I need to tell you about Sacred Heart Orphanage, about what they're really doing to the girls there. The sheriff's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. Sacred Heart? That's a fine institution, child. Are you one of their students? Margaret felt her heart sink. Even here, even with a man who seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare, the orphanage's reputation preceded her. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I was brought there 2 weeks ago after my parents died in the mill fire in Albany. But Sheriff, they're not caring for children there, they're killing them. O'Brien's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, and finally skepticism. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Whitfield. The Sacred Heart congregation has an excellent reputation throughout the region. They've been caring for orphaned children for 20 years. That's what everyone thinks, Margaret said desperately. But last night I saw what really happens to the girls who get transferred to new families. They're not being adopted, Sheriff. They're being murdered in some kind of religious ritual. She told him everything: the underground chambers, the caskets marked with the names of supposedly transferred girls, the ritual altar stained with blood, and the narrow escape through the cave system. As she spoke, O'Brien's expression grew increasingly troubled, but she couldn't tell if it was because he believed her or because he thought she was delusional. These are very disturbing claims, O'Brien said when she finished. But I have to ask, do you have any proof of what you're telling me? Any evidence beyond your own testimony? Margaret's heart sank. The other girls who escaped with me saw everything too. Sarah Mitchell and Anna Kowalski. They're hiding outside right now. I'll need to speak with them as well, O'Brien said. But Miss Whitfield, I have to tell you that this story is difficult to believe. The Sacred Heart congregation is headed by Reverend Blackwood, one of the most respected religious leaders in the region. The county supervisors inspect the facility regularly. The county supervisors are part of it, Margaret exclaimed. They're not really government officials, they're members of the congregation. They help select which girls should be killed next. O'Brien held up a hand to calm her. I understand you're frightened, child. Running away from the orphanage at night, getting lost in the caves, it could cause anyone to imagine terrible things. Margaret realized with growing horror that he didn't believe her, or perhaps worse. Perhaps he did believe her but was part of the conspiracy himself. Sheriff, please, you have to investigate. If I'm wrong, what harm could it do to take a look around the facility? I'll tell you what, O'Brien said, reaching for his hat. Let me speak with your friends and then we'll all take a ride out to Sacred Heart. I'm sure Reverend Blackwood can clear up this misunderstanding. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. A visit to Sacred Heart would be a death sentence for all three of them. By now, the congregation would have had hours to clean up any evidence of their ritual chamber and prepare explanations for the missing girls. Actually, she said, backing toward the door, maybe I should think about this more. Maybe I was confused, but O'Brien was already moving toward the door, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. Now, Miss Whitfield, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. You've made some very serious accusations, and they need to be properly investigated. Margaret bolted through the door and ran across the street, shouting to Sarah and Anna as she ran. "It's a trap, he's taking us back there." The three girls ran through the streets of Whitmore Valley with Sheriff O'Brien in pursuit, his shouts bringing other men out of the shops and businesses. Margaret realized that their appearance, three teenage girls in torn nightgowns running through town, marked them as escapees from Sacred Heart, as clearly as if they wore signs around their necks. "This way," Sarah shouted, leading them down an alley between two buildings. They could hear men calling to each other, organizing a search. The entire town seemed to be turning against them. They emerged from the alley into a residential area, where housewives hanging laundry stopped to stare at the fleeing girls. An elderly woman pointed down the street and called out, "They went that way, Sheriff." Margaret understood now that Sacred Heart's influence wasn't limited to corrupt officials. The entire community was complicit, either through active participation or willful blindness. 20 years of missing girls had been explained away as successful adoptions, and no one had asked uncomfortable questions because the answers might threaten their comfortable assumptions about their moral community. They ran until their lungs burned and their cut feet left bloody footprints on the ground, but the sounds of pursuit never faded. Finally, exhausted and desperate, they took shelter in the bell tower of the Protestant church Margaret had mentioned earlier. "They'll find us here," Anna sobbed, collapsing against the stone wall. "There's nowhere to go." Margaret climbed to the window that faced toward Sacred Heart and looked out across the valley. In the distance, she could see riders heading toward the orphanage, probably Sheriff O'Brien sending word to Reverend Blackwood about the escaped girls. Soon, the entire congregation would be mobilized to hunt them down. But as she watched, something else caught her attention. A lone rider was approaching Whitmore Valley from the east, moving at a gallop and raising a cloud of dust behind his horse. Unlike the local men she had seen, this rider wore the uniform of a federal marshal, and his purposeful approach suggested official business rather than casual travel. "Sarah," she called softly, "look at this." Sarah joined her at the window, and her face brightened with the first hope they had felt since their escape. "Federal marshal? That's not local authority. He wouldn't be under the congregation's influence." "But how do we reach him without being caught?" Anna asked from her position near the stairs. Margaret studied the layout of the town below. The marshal was riding directly toward the main street, where he would probably stop at the sheriff's office first. If they could intercept him before O'Brien poisoned his mind against them. "There," she said, pointing to a route that would take them through back gardens and vacant lots. "We can reach the street near the general store. If we time it right, we can get to him before anyone else does." It was a desperate gamble, but their only alternative was to wait for capture. They climbed down from the bell tower and began their final sprint through Whitmore Valley, racing against time and the organized manhunt that was closing in around them. Behind them, the bells of Sacred Heart Orphanage began to toll, a sound that carried across the valley like a death knell, announcing to the faithful that their escaped prey would soon be returned to the fold. Margaret ran harder, driven by the knowledge that this federal marshal represented their last hope of exposing the truth about Sacred Heart. If they failed to reach him, if he too proved to be corrupted or unwilling to believe their story, then 73 dead girls would be joined by 3 more, and the nightmare would continue indefinitely. The marshal's horse thundered down Main Street as the 3 girls burst from an alley, their torn nightgowns and bandaged feet making them look like refugees from a battlefield. Margaret threw herself directly into the horse's path, forcing the rider to rein in sharply to avoid trampling her. "Marshal!" she gasped, looking up at a stern-faced man in his 40s with steel-gray eyes and a badge that gleamed like hope itself. "Please, you have to listen to us. We've escaped from Sacred Heart Orphanage and they're trying to kill us." The marshal looked down at the 3 desperate girls, then at the crowd of townsmen who were running toward them from all directions. His hand moved to his weapon, but Margaret couldn't tell if it was to protect them or to enforce their capture. "Well," he said in a voice that carried the authority of the federal government, "this is certainly an interesting welcome to Whitmore Valley. Everything now depended on whether this man would prove to be their salvation or their doom." As the sounds of pursuit grew closer, Margaret held her breath and waited for his decision. The fate of Sacred Heart's remaining victims hung in the balance. Federal Marshal Daniel Pierce had seen many things during his 15 years of service, But 3 blood-soaked girls in nightgowns throwing themselves at his horse was a new experience. His steel-gray eyes took in their injuries, their terror, and the mob of townsmen converging on them with an efficiency born of long practice at reading dangerous situations. "Easy there," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion while keeping his hand near his Colt revolver. "I'm Marshal Pierce, and you ladies appear to be in some considerable distress." "Marshal, please," Margaret gasped, still trying to catch her breath. "We've escaped from Sacred Heart Orphanage. They're murdering children there, and the whole town is helping them cover it up." Sheriff O'Brien pushed through the crowd, his face red with exertion and embarrassment. "Marshal Pierce, thank goodness you're here. These girls are disturbed runaways from the local orphanage. They've been telling wild stories about—" "I'll hear their story myself, Sheriff," Pierce interrupted, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "In private, is there somewhere we can speak without an audience?" O'Brien's face darkened. "Now see here, Marshal. This is a local matter. These girls are residents of Sacred Heart, and Reverend Blackwood has legal custody. Federal jurisdiction trumps local custody when children claim they're fleeing for their lives," Pierce said flatly. "I suggest you disperse this crowd before someone gets hurt." Margaret felt a surge of hope as she watched the federal marshal face down the local sheriff. Here, finally, was someone with the authority and the will to investigate their claims. But her hope was tempered by the knowledge that the congregation had survived for 20 years by eliminating threats to their operation. Pierce led the 3 girls into the general store, clearing out the customers with a few sharp words and positioning himself where he could watch both the front door and the street outside. His movements were those of a man accustomed to danger, and Margaret noticed that he kept his weapon within easy reach. "Now then," he said, his voice gentle but focused, "start from the beginning and tell me everything." Margaret began with her arrival at Sacred Heart 2 weeks ago, but Pierce interrupted her almost immediately. "Wait, what did you say your name was?" "Margaret Whitfield. My parents died in the mill fire in Albany 3 weeks ago." Pierce's expression changed subtly. "Miss Whitfield, I'm here in Whitmore Valley specifically because of a letter that arrived at the federal marshal's office in Albany last week. A letter signed with your name, claiming that children were being murdered at Sacred Heart Orphanage." Margaret stared at him in confusion. "I never sent any letter. I've only been here 2 weeks, and I just learned about the murders last night." "The letter was dated 3 weeks ago," Pierce said slowly. "Before your parents died, before you came to Sacred Heart." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "The handwriting appears to be that of a young woman, and the details about the orphanage's layout are remarkably accurate." Sarah leaned forward to look at the letter. "That's Louise's handwriting," she said with certainty. "Ruth's sister, Louise. She must have found a way to get a letter out before they killed her." Pierce read the letter aloud. "Dear Federal Marshal, my name is Margaret Whitfield, and I am writing to warn you about terrible crimes being committed at Sacred Heart Orphanage in Whitmore Valley. Girls are disappearing from the records, claimed to be adopted but actually murdered in underground chambers. The congregation that runs this place practices ritual killings disguised as religious purification. By the time you receive this, I may be dead, but others remain in danger. Please investigate immediately. The basement holds the evidence you need." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes as she understood Louise's desperate gambit. Knowing she was about to be selected for transfer, Ruth's sister had somehow managed to smuggle out a letter calling for help, using a false name to protect herself and ensure the letter would be taken seriously if investigators arrived. "Louise saved us," she whispered. "She died to give us a chance." Pierce folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. "Miss Morrison's sacrifice won't be wasted if we can gather enough evidence to shut down this operation. But I need you to understand the danger we're all in now. If this congregation has been operating for 20 years, they have significant resources and influence. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted outside the general store. Through the windows, they could see a group of men in black robes gathering in the street, led by Reverend Blackwood himself. The townspeople who had been pursuing the girls now stood back respectfully, but their eyes remained fixed on the store with predatory intensity. "Marshal Pierce," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a seasoned preacher. "I understand you're harboring 3 disturbed children who have fled from our care. As their legal guardian, I must insist that you return them to Sacred Heart immediately. Pierce stepped to the doorway, his hand resting openly on his weapon. "Reverend Blackwood, I presume. I'm here on federal business investigating allegations of criminal activity. The children will remain in protective custody until my investigation is complete." "What allegations?" Blackwood asked, though Margaret could see the calculation behind his eyes. "These girls have clearly suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Sacred Heart has medical facilities to care for their condition." "Allegations of murder, Reverend. Multiple murders spanning 20 years. Pierce's voice was steady, but Margaret could see the tension in his posture. "I'll be requiring access to all areas of your facility, including any basement levels." The crowd around Blackwood stirred uneasily. Several of the black-robed figures exchanged glances, and Margaret noticed that they had positioned themselves to block all the main streets leading out of town. Whatever happened next, the congregation was prepared to prevent anyone from leaving Whitmore Valley alive. "That's quite impossible," Blackwood said smoothly. "Sacred Heart is private property, and you have no warrant for such an intrusion." Pierce smiled grimly. "Actually, Reverend, federal marshals have broad authority to investigate interstate crimes. And when children claim they're fleeing from murder, that creates exigent circumstances that override property rights." Margaret could see that the standoff was reaching a critical point. Blackwood's followers were armed. She could see the bulges of concealed weapons beneath their robes, and the marshal was vastly outnumbered. If shooting started, they would all die in the crossfire. But Pierce had one more card to play. He pulled out a brass whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts that echoed across the valley. Within moments, the sound of galloping horses could be heard approaching from the east. "I brought backup," Pierce explained to the increasingly agitated crowd. 12 federal deputies, all armed and authorized to use lethal force in defense of federal officials. Blackwood's face went through a series of expressions as he calculated his rapidly diminishing options. 20 years of careful planning and gradual corruption of local authorities were being swept away by federal intervention that he hadn't anticipated. "This is a grave mistake, Marshal," he said finally. "You're interfering with legitimate religious practices protected by the Constitution." "Murder isn't protected by any constitution I've sworn to uphold," Pierce replied, "and neither is conspiracy to obstruct justice." The federal deputies arrived in a cloud of dust, their horses snorting and stamping as they formed a protective circle around the general store. These were hard men, with weathered faces and weapons that showed signs of frequent use. The townspeople began to disperse as they realized that the balance of power had shifted decisively. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "You have no idea what forces you're dealing with, Marshal. The Sacred Heart congregation has friends in very high places. This interference will not go unpunished." Pierce studied the Reverend with the cold efficiency of a man accustomed to threats. "We'll see about that, Reverend. Deputy Morrison, take half the men and secure the orphanage. I want every room searched, every basement chamber mapped, and every record confiscated. Deputy Clark, establish a perimeter around the town. No one enters or leaves without my authorization." As the deputies moved to carry out their orders, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They had succeeded in bringing federal authority to bear on Sacred Heart, but she knew that the congregation wouldn't surrender without a fight. Too much was at stake, and too many people were complicit in 20 years of atrocities. "What about the other girls still at the orphanage?" Sarah asked urgently. "Ruth and Helen and all the others. They're still trapped there." Pierce nodded grimly. "That's our first priority, but I need you 3 to understand something. This investigation could take weeks, and the danger isn't over. The congregation has had 20 years to establish networks of support. There may be attempts to silence witnesses or destroy evidence." As if to emphasize his point, smoke began to rise from the direction of Sacred Heart Orphanage. Even from miles away, they could see the orange glow of flames against the overcast sky. "They're destroying the evidence," Margaret said, her heart sinking. "All those records, all those names." Pierce was already moving, barking orders to his deputies. "Fire brigade now. Save what you can of the building and get those children out safely." He turned to Margaret, Sarah, and Anna. "You 3 stay here with Deputy Williams. Don't trust anyone except federal officers. And even then, be careful who you talk to." As the marshal and most of his men rode hard toward the burning orphanage, Margaret stood at the window of the general store and watched the smoke rising from Sacred Heart. Somewhere in that building, Ruth and Helen and dozens of other girls were trapped in a nightmare that was about to become even worse. The final battle for Sacred Heart Orphanage had begun, and she could only pray that they had acted in time to save at least some of the children who remained under the congregation's control. The ride to Sacred Heart took 20 minutes that felt like hours. By the time Marshal Pierce and his deputies reached the orphanage, the entire east wing was engulfed in flames, and black smoke poured from the upper story windows. The fire had been set with deliberate precision, not to destroy the building completely, but to eliminate specific areas that contained the most damaging evidence. Pierce organized his men with military efficiency. Morrison, take 3 men and search the basement levels before the smoke gets too thick. Clark, coordinate with the local fire brigade. Save what you can of the records office. Williams, get those children out of the building safely and account for every single one. The scene that greeted the deputies inside Sacred Heart was one of carefully orchestrated chaos. The nuns moved through the corridors with practiced calm, shepherding groups of terrified children toward the exits while simultaneously directing the firefighting efforts. But Pierce's experienced eye caught the subtle signs of deception. Rooms that had been hastily cleared of their contents, corridors blocked off by fallen debris that looked suspiciously intentional, and a notable absence of the older girls who should have been helping with the evacuation. Sister Prudence approached the marshal with the same severe demeanor she had shown Margaret 2 weeks earlier. Marshal Pierce, this is a terrible tragedy. The fire began in the East Wing storage rooms, probably faulty oil lamps. We're doing everything possible to save the children. Where are all the older girls? Pierce asked bluntly. I count 41 children evacuated, but the records I've seen suggest you house more than that. The older girls were transferred to new families just this morning, Sister Prudence replied smoothly. Such fortunate timing. They're safe with their new parents in Rochester. Pierce studied her face with the cold intensity of a man who had interrogated countless liars. 9 girls transferred in a single morning to families that happened to make requests on the same day federal marshals arrived in town. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Marshal. So does murder, Sister. Before Sister Prudence could respond, Deputy Morrison emerged from a basement stairwell, his face grim and his uniform covered in soot. Marshal, you need to see what we found downstairs, and you're not going to like it. Pierce followed Morrison into the basement, where the deputy's lantern illuminated a scene that exceeded even Margaret's horrific descriptions. The underground chamber she had discovered was only one of several such rooms. The deputies had found an entire complex of stone chambers connected by narrow passages, each one serving a different purpose in the congregation's systematic murder of orphaned children. The main ritual chamber contained the blood-stained altar Margaret had described, but it was the adjacent rooms that revealed the full scope of the atrocities. A preparation chamber where the victims had been held before their deaths, a dissection room where the bodies had been processed, and finally the crypt where 73 small caskets bore testimony to 20 years of unthinkable evil. Jesus Christ, Pierce whispered, his hardened exterior cracking for the first time. How many children? Morrison consulted his hastily scrawled notes. 73 caskets with nameplates. But Marshal, there are at least 20 more empty caskets along the back wall. Fresh built, like they were expecting more victims. Pierce examined one of the nameplates by lantern light. Emily Susan Crawford, transferred June 12, 1858. Purified, not forgotten. The brass was still bright and new, suggesting the murders had continued right up until the federal investigation began. What about the missing girls from this morning? Pierce asked. Any sign of them? Morrison's face went pale. We found evidence of recent activity in the preparation chamber, restraints that are still warm, blood that hasn't had time to dry completely. He paused, struggling with what he had to say next. Marshal, I think they killed those girls this morning when they realized federal marshals were coming. Pierce felt a cold rage building in his chest. 9 children murdered in cold blood to eliminate witnesses. The congregation's willingness to escalate their crimes showed just how much they had to lose if the truth came out. Any sign of survivors? He asked. Actually, yes. Morrison led him deeper into the complex, to a chamber they hadn't seen before. We found this behind a false wall in the ritual room. The chamber beyond was smaller but newer than the others, with iron bars across the entrance and evidence of recent habitation. Straw mattresses lay scattered across the floor, along with empty food bowls and buckets that served as primitive sanitation. Scratches on the stone walls showed where fingernails had worn grooves in desperate attempts to escape. A holding area, Pierce realized. They kept some of the girls alive down here. For how long do you think? Pierce examined the scratches more closely. Some of them formed crude calendars, marks grouped in sets of 7 to track the passing weeks. Months, maybe longer. They weren't just killing them immediately. They were keeping them for extended periods. The implications were horrifying. The congregation hadn't simply been murdering orphaned children. They had been holding them captive in underground chambers, probably subjecting them to prolonged torture and abuse before the final ritual killings. The calculated cruelty was beyond anything Pierce had encountered in his years of law enforcement. A shout from above interrupted his examination of the chambers. Pierce climbed the basement stairs to find Deputy Clark waiting with urgent news. "Marshal, we've got a situation developing outside. The congregation members have been gathering in the woods around the property. We count at least 30 armed men, and they appear to be preparing for some kind of assault." Pierce stepped outside the burning orphanage and surveyed the situation. The fire was largely contained now, thanks to the efforts of the local volunteer fire brigade, but smoke still poured from several windows. More importantly, he could see movement in the tree line that surrounded Sacred Heart. Dark figures positioning themselves with the practiced coordination of men who had drilled for this eventuality. They've been planning for this possibility, he realized. They have a contingency plan for federal investigation. Reverend Blackwood emerged from the forest, still wearing his ceremonial robes but now armed with a rifle that he carried with obvious familiarity. His followers spread out in a semicircle around the orphanage grounds, their weapons trained on the federal deputies. "Marshal Pierce," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the smoky air. "You have trespassed on sacred ground and defiled our holy work. We cannot allow you to leave with knowledge that would destroy our mission." Pierce positioned his men defensively around the building, using the stone walls as cover. "Reverend, you're surrounded by federal officers. Surrender now, and you'll face trial instead of execution." "There will be no trial," Blackwood replied. "The work we do here is ordained by God himself. We purify souls that would otherwise be damned to eternal suffering. The children we have saved number in the hundreds. They are in paradise now, cleansed of sin and welcomed into the kingdom of heaven." Pierce had heard enough. "Open fire!" The battle for Sacred Heart Orphanage erupted in a storm of gunfire that echoed across Whitmore Valley. The congregation members had the advantage of numbers and defensive positions, but Pierce's deputies were better trained and equipped with more modern weapons. The firefight continued for nearly an hour, with bullets chipping stone from the orphanage walls and smoke from both gunpowder and the dying fire creating a hellish landscape around the building. When the shooting finally stopped, 12 members of the Sacred Heart congregation lay dead in the autumn leaves, including Reverend Blackwood himself. The federal deputies had suffered 2 wounded but no fatalities, a testament to their superior training and equipment. But the victory came at a cost. As Pierce searched the bodies of the fallen congregation members, he found documents that revealed the true scope of their operation. Sacred Heart wasn't their only facility. They operated similar institutions in at least 3 other states, all masquerading as charitable organizations while systematically murdering the children in their care. "How many more children are out there?" Deputy Morrison asked as they examined the papers by lamplight. Pierce studied a map marked with locations in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. This has been going on for decades, and Sacred Heart was just one link in a much larger chain. The federal investigation that followed would eventually reveal the full extent of the Sacred Heart network. Over the next 2 years, federal marshals raided similar facilities across the Midwest, uncovering evidence of systematic child murder that shocked the nation. The surviving members of the congregation were tried in federal court and hanged for their crimes, but the psychological damage they had inflicted could never be fully repaired. Margaret, Sarah, and Anna were placed in the care of legitimate charitable organizations, but the trauma of their experiences at Sacred Heart would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Margaret eventually became a federal investigator herself, dedicating her career to protecting children from predators who used religion and charity as masks for unspeakable evil. The ruins of Sacred Heart Orphanage were demolished in the spring of 1860, and the underground chambers were sealed with concrete and steel. A memorial was erected on the site bearing the names of the 73 girls who had died in the congregation's ritual chambers, along with a simple inscription, "Remembered." not forgotten. But late at night, when the wind blew through the pine trees that had been planted over the sealed chambers, some residents of Whitmore Valley claimed they could still hear the sound of children crying. 73 young voices calling out from the darkness, finally able to tell their stories to a world that was ready to listen. The Sacred Heart Orphanage had been destroyed, but the memory of its victims would endure forever, a reminder that evil often wore the mask of righteousness, and that the price of stopping it was eternal vigilance against those who would harm the innocent. Louise Morrison's letter had saved not just Margaret, Sarah, and Anna, but hundreds of other children whose lives would have been lost if the Sacred Heart Network had continued to operate. Her sacrifice ensured that the words, "purified, not forgotten," would never again be carved beside a child's name in the darkness beneath a place that called itself holy. The truth had finally come to light, and the dead could rest in peace. In the autumn of 1879, Margaret Whitfield, now Marshal Margaret Whitfield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, returned to Whitmore Valley for the first time since that terrible November night in 1859. The town had changed considerably. The lumber industry had moved on to richer forests, and many of the families who had turned blind eyes to Sacred Heart's atrocities had relocated to more prosperous regions. The memorial marking the site of the former orphanage stood in a grove of mature pine trees, their branches swaying gently in the crisp autumn breeze. Someone, probably Ruth Morrison, who had moved to Albany and become a teacher, left fresh flowers at the base of the monument every month. 73 names were carved into the black granite, each one representing a life stolen and a family destroyed. Margaret knelt beside the memorial and placed her own bouquet of autumn wildflowers among the others. At 43, she bore the weathered look of someone who had spent 2 decades fighting monsters that most people preferred not to believe existed. The federal investigation she had begun as a traumatized teenager had grown into a national crusade against institutional abuse, and the laws that now protected orphaned children could be traced directly back to the horrors uncovered at Sacred Heart. "I kept my promise, Louise," she whispered to the carved name of Ruth's sister. "They never got away with it, and they never will again." A footstep behind her made Margaret turn. Ruth Morrison stood at the edge of the memorial grove, her graying hair pulled back in the same severe style she had worn as a child at Sacred Heart. Now 51, she visited this place every year on the anniversary of their escape. "I was hoping you'd come this year," Ruth said, approaching the memorial. "Sarah wrote to say you'd been asking about the old records again." Margaret nodded. "The Pennsylvania facility was the last one. We shut it down last month and found evidence that might lead to other locations. After 20 years, we're still finding pieces of their network. How many children did we save, do you think?" "Thousands, probably. Maybe tens of thousands who would have been victims if we hadn't stopped it when we did." Margaret stood and brushed dirt from her knees. "But it never feels like enough when you stand here looking at these names." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, 2 middle-aged women united by shared trauma and the determination to ensure it would never be repeated. The wind through the pines created a sound like whispered voices, and Margaret sometimes chose to believe it was the 73 girls telling them that their sacrifice had meaning, that their deaths had ultimately saved countless others. "Do you ever wonder," Ruth asked quietly, "what would have happened if Louise hadn't managed to get that letter out?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "The congregation would have continued operating indefinitely. Sacred Heart would still be active today, and there would be hundreds more names on this memorial. Your sister saved more lives than we'll ever know." As the sun set behind the hills of Whitmore Valley, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Margaret and Ruth walked together back toward the town. Behind them, the memorial stood sentinel over the sealed chambers that had once housed unspeakable evil, ensuring that the children who died there would never be forgotten. The Sacred Heart Orphanage was gone, but its legacy lived on in the laws that protected the innocent and the determination of those who remembered that evil often wore the mask of righteousness. The price of freedom, Margaret had learned, was not just eternal vigilance. It was the courage to act when vigilance revealed the unthinkable truth. In the growing darkness, the pine trees whispered their secrets to the wind, and 73 voices finally found peace in knowing that their stories had been told, their deaths had been avenged, and their sacrifice had ensured that no other children would suffer as they had suffered. The nightmare of Sacred Heart was over, but the memory would endure forever. a reminder that even in the darkest places, truth could still find a way to emerge into the light.